It's all kind of coming together. Some really great speakers, and they've just launched today an inclusive innovation district. So they had some of the companies there. The Global Disability Innovation Hub is based there now. So really great stuff. So that was at Here East in Olympic Park. Yeah. So there was a big event there this morning, which was kind of the official close of London Tech Group. Are we done? Are we finished?
Yeah, apparently we're doing a panel now.
Okay, great.
Just in case I was somewhere 5 minutes before and could make it.
Yeah, David. Is it recording? Yeah. Ready when you are, absolutely. Yep.
Okay, good afternoon everybody. Welcome to the China Britain Business Council. I don't know, how are we? I've not really been outside recently, but apparently it's quite hot out there. Are we good with the temperature? Is it about right?
Yeah, it's great.
Yeah, I know it can sometimes go one way or the other, can't it?
I'm liking it. It's good.
If we need to tweak it, just let me know. Just in terms of housekeeping, obviously we've got tea and coffee at the back. If you haven't grabbed one yet, please feel free to do so. In terms of facilities, if you do need the bathroom, it's just back outside near the lift. So there is a double door to go through again. So feel free if you do need to leave the room. I expect there may be a few late stragglers coming in, so if you can just bear with us. I know it's very hot outside. I'd just like to thank everyone for actually coming out on a Friday afternoon on such a hot day in London. I think what that means is that this is a really fascinating subject for us all to be here to discuss. So hopefully we'll have a really great session. I know that it's the end of a very long week, London Tech Week. I know Russ, you're at the end of a marathon week of events, so I'm sure that everyone's tired and ready for the weekend. So we'll try to keep this session as informal as we can. As we go through, if you have a question, feel free to throw your hand up. I'm sure the panelists would be pleased to kind of address any questions you may have. It's Friday, so there's no fire alarms planned. If there is an alarm, it'll be the real thing. So just follow the fire signs. You'll see that we're videoing, so we're not live streaming, but we will be using some of the content for some post-event media. So just to make everyone aware. My name's Mark Headley, so I'm the head of tech and innovation here at the China Britain Business Council. Some of you are probably familiar with CBBC, but we're a different CBBC. We help British companies to do business in China, and Chinese companies come into the UK to collaborate and forge partnerships. So we're a membership organisation, and we also provide commercial services to companies looking to do business in China. Today's event is not specifically about China, though I'm sure that we may touch on China, given its role in sort of global innovation and its increasing influence on all of our lives. But the broader topic that we're here to discuss today is design and innovation, and how design and innovation is really a driver for product development and how it's changing our lives. What we've tried to do with this really clever pun is to sort of link it in with the theme of diversity and inclusion, which has obviously been a thread that's run through this week at London Tech Week. And everyone is talking about the importance of diversity, whether it's on boardrooms, whether it's in terms of innovation. It's critically important, we would argue, in terms of creating more value in the economy. So, two topics really. What do we mean by diversity, by design and innovation, and how does diversity and inclusion actually support the innovation agenda? Obviously, we're linking this to Asia Pacific as well. So I think the role of China and the wider Asia Pacific, and how the East is influencing innovation in terms of the market, in terms of hubs of innovation, in terms of manufacturing. So we're going to touch on that as well. So without further ado, I'd like to just very briefly introduce the panellists. I will let the panellists talk a little bit more about their expertise around innovation. I'm not sure I've got these all in the right order, so I'm just going to go with the order that I've got them down here. I think probably Russ Shaw doesn't need much of an introduction to most people here. So Russ is the founder of Tech London Advocate. In fact, let me put the slide on. Founder of Tech London Advocates and Global Tech Advocates. Private sector-led groups of leaders promoting tech ecosystems in London and cities around the world and addressing key issues facing businesses across those ecosystems. So Russ has also been appointed as the London Tech Ambassador by the Mayor of London's office, and he also last year was awarded a CBE in the New Year's Honours List for services to technology and business. Patricia, is it Lala?
Yeah.
So you did your MA in immersive storytelling, and you're now working on an AR music heritage app about the Windrush generation in London, inspired by your own parents' emigration from Trinidad. You're a creative practitioner making an AR trail for Lambeth as well, as part of the Story Trails UK nationwide project, which I think we're going to hear about in a minute. John Mathers, Chair of the British Design Fund and co-founder of Design Age Accelerator. So John, I'm not sure if you forgive me for saying that you've been in the area, working in the area of brand and design for 40 years, in a number of different roles with design consultancies and corporates, including head of brand at Safeway. You led the UK Design Council for several years and established the British Design Fund, focusing on financing and supporting the design of British products. And finally, we have Angela Chan, doctoral researcher and head of inclusion at Story Trails Unboxed. So Angela's specialism is in creative clustering policy, diversity and innovation, digital and immersive storytelling. You also, I believe, worked as the head of creative diversity at Channel 4 and also as a diversity executive for the BBC. So real expertise around broadcast media and unlocking underrepresented voices and reaching diverse audiences. Okay, so that's our panel. We're going to kick off, I think, really just by focusing on this first point around diversity and inclusion. So grateful if the panelists could tell me something about your role and how it relates to these two topics of design and innovation and diversity and inclusion. And I think maybe start with Angela.
Okay. I mean, it is the subject of my PhD, so I'm so grateful to you for asking me, and what a week it's been. In my view, you can't have one without the other, especially in the modern climate. You know, what we used to label as ethnic minorities are the global majority, and if you don't have D&I considerations in your design and your innovation strategies, you aren't catering to your audience, you're missing a huge section of your potential market. And I've seen, by working within the Creative Cluster Programme, so the government a few years ago, the UK government, funded to the tune of about 100 million UK clusters led by universities to work with industry in different regions of the UK where there was a specialism. So it might be in fashion and digital. Ours was immersive tech in the areas to the southwest of London. And you know, what we found was initially it attracted a lot of white men in their 40s called Paul. And I'm not even kidding, they all came from architecture backgrounds, they'd all started AR companies, maybe they're in their 50s and they'd been in television. And I arrived to do this PhD, fresh from broadcasting, where we did a lot of work around diversity, to find that there was no conversation to be had really. There was, right in the middle of Black Lives Matter, and we were trying to make things for the heritage sector, but nobody really had a feeling for that kind of work and you'd find that stories would get dropped along the way. So for instance, we were doing a story with Parliament, and we wanted to tell a story about a black parliamentarian, a black lobbyist, but the story got pushed to one side because there was fear that we wouldn't quite be able to deliver it because there wasn't the archive. So, I think this focus on design and innovation, for me, it starts with diversity and inclusion. Like, what different stories can we tell? What different markets can we serve? And whose voices can we liberate to lead that innovation?
Okay, yeah, and I think we're going to talk a little bit more about the actual storytelling in a moment with the slides. So we'll maybe come to that in a moment. Maybe should we move to Russ?
Sure. Well, I think in terms of diversity and inclusion, we have done a lot in that space because the tech sector here in London and the UK is 80% white men. And it is a very significant issue and challenge for our community to diversify. We know the business case has shown time and time again that diverse startups, diverse scale-ups, diverse tech companies produce better products and services and are more profitable. I actually, on Monday afternoon of this week, I co-hosted a diversity and inclusion roundtable with Secretary of State Nadine Dorries with a number of advocates in our community. We have working groups. We have a Black Women in Tech group, a Women in Tech group, a Tech for Disabilities group, an LGBT group, an Asians in Tech group, and to come and have her listen and understand the frustrations and challenges that they're facing in a tech sector that is predominantly white men. And as we talk about things like the metaverse and the new technologies and the artificial intelligence data sets, we're now replicating all of these things that white men have built over the past 10, 15, 20 years in tech and putting it into our future virtual world. So it's something that we are very, very conscious of. We're very, frankly, uncomfortable with, and really trying to work to move the needle to make sure that our UK tech sector, which is now viewed as a world-leading sector. If you look at the investment numbers, the job creation, the tech unicorns, we're on a par with the US, China, and India, especially with some of the announcements that came out on Monday of this week with the investment levels into UK tech. We were second to just the US in terms of the investment in the sector. So it's a really positive story, but it's got a big black mark in terms of how we address diversity and inclusion. Obviously, the sector is also very focused on design and innovation. We have so many disruptive businesses in our ecosystem that are driving innovation that threaten more traditional businesses. But I think, and my personal view is, to a great point that you made, Angela, is if we don't build these businesses with a diverse workforce, we're going to struggle to keep driving that innovation that we desperately need to forge a tech sector that continues to be world leading.
Sure, yeah. Patricia, I wonder, is that your experience in terms of as an entrepreneur and creative innovator? I mean, are there kind of challenges that you see within the business ecosystem in terms of actually developing a business and going out there and doing these things?
Absolutely. I mean, my background was originally TV production, radio, that kind of stuff. And I moved into immersive because I just love the medium. I just find it really exciting. But also, my experience of being in that traditional television background were those barriers, which, the white guy called Paul, whatever. It's not always like that, but there was a lot of that. And, I'm hoping that with a new kind of medium, a new sort of frontier, we can sort of break down barriers. I sort of operate through my own limited company, which is basically me, called Wolfskill. And what I'm excited about is sort of developing my own sort of creative IP and exploiting it by collaborating with tech partners. So that augmented reality prototype, which was my final project on my MA, that is what I'd like to do going forwards. It's quite tricky because when you're not used to having that voice, it's something that you kind of need a bit of guidance for, I find. So kind of mentoring has been really useful for me. But you know, the Story Trails project, which we can talk about, has been fantastic for that. It's
Yeah.
been it's a very challenging, ambitious project, but I've found that I've been able to have a voice through it.
Great. We'll come back to that in a moment. Maybe we'll just, John, I'm not sure if you have any thoughts about this. I think it was really interesting what Russ was saying about how the tech sector really struggles with diversity, particularly big tech, etc., in terms of things like algorithm bias and all that sort of stuff. But in terms of the wider sector around sort of product innovation, I suppose, is that something that's reflected, do you think, in other industries, other areas?
Well, I'm not going to, I think you actually, the three of you have actually articulated very effectively the sort of diversity and inclusion challenges that the sector faces. I think there's, I wear two hats. So I chair a thing called British Design Fund, so we invest in well-designed British products and services, which doesn't mean to say we're against technology.
Yeah.
Technology can often be the backdrop to it, but it's not technology first and foremost. But the other thing I'm heavily involved in is the whole area of healthy aging, and you're probably aware there's a government initiative called Healthy Aging, huge amounts of money being put behind it. Age Tech, which actually I saw very little of in London Tech Week.
Next year.
Next year, well, next year.
Yeah, let's do it. Let's do
Okay,
it.
definitely. But I mean, they say that Age Tech is where FinTech was in 2008. So the potential is enormous, and yet not many people are really aware of it. And I think there's an area of diversity and inclusion that we as a country are very poor at, and that is that we are ageist. We're an ageist population. We think, sorry?
Species.
Yeah. But we think that as people get old, they become useless and they don't have a role to play. And actually the opposite is true. I mean, it's quite interesting that there's some quite interesting larger companies starting to recognize that the old policies of trying to get rid of older workers is actually counterproductive, and that issue is should be keeping older workers because they can make it work. And one of the particular projects I'm involved in is, well, it was Edinburgh University led, but it's now King's College led, called Healthier Working Lives for Older Care Workers. So how do we keep older care workers in the system where the challenge is that they're all leaving because actually they're not rewarded, not recognised, and they don't have the sort of services and products, and often technology services and products that could actually make their lives an awful lot easier. The market is huge, and design is at the very heart of it. So, I mean, British Design Fund, you know, we're about innovation. I thought it was really interesting that Rishi Sunak, at the very beginning of London Tech Week, talked about three things: capital, people, and ideas. And you know, design is at the very heart of all of these three things.
Yeah, and I think I guess what you're saying, really, what you're alluding to, is the fact that what do we mean by diversity? Right?
Yeah, well, yes, I think we need to be.
Because I think there's often an assumption that is about race, and it's about it's about things like gender preference, etc., etc. But you know, we're talking about London Tech Week, and you know, there is a world outside London, and you know, when we see increasing division between, economic division between different regions of the UK, there's also that aspect of diversity, or those voices being heard and being brought into the discussion. So I think we could almost spend all day talking about that. Did you want to talk a little bit about the slides that we have?
In a minute, can I add something to what John said? Because
Yeah.
I think where these thoughts come together around design is, I always like the example of the sensory spoon. So if you've ever seen the sensory spoon, like kids have these rubberized spoons for when they're weaning. That started as a bit of tech, low tech, for the ageing sector.
Right.
There were things used in homes for older people to help them eat and hold on to their spoon. That then became the baby spoon, and now you find it quite commonly, across that sort of design sector. So often, diversity in design, it starts with a specific need that's niche, and then it has a more universal use. And I like to reframe that thinking, whatever project we're working on. So we'll talk about the storytelling project, but actually it starts with a need. for better representation, both regionally and in terms of marginalised voices, working class voices across the country. But that need becomes the motivation for the technology, rather than thinking, what shall we do with the tech, which never leads you anywhere interesting. But what's the actual need in society, and how can technology support that? And for me, that's the sort of framing. It doesn't really matter what need you're answering. It's somebody's need that isn't attended to.
I think that's a really interesting point that you make about how you bring one technology from one sector to the other. So sort of one of the questions that Mark asked us to think about was what have we heard this week that has most impressed us about technology. And the one for me is how, and I apologize, I can't remember whether I heard it on Tech Week or whether I heard it just simply on the news, but it's somebody has brought the scanning technology from hospitals into airports. So suddenly they found scanning technology that means you don't have to take your laptop out of your bag, you don't have to take your toiletries out of the bag, you just shove it all through the thing, and you've now got 360-degree scanning which has come from medical, which is going to completely revolutionize that painful journey through airports. And I just think that's a really interesting area that we need to be looking at more, is looking at how you can bring technology from one sector and apply it to another sector in really meaningful ways.
Yeah.
And it's about understanding the problem area in the first instance. And all the news is about not enough staff in airports, painful flights being cancelled, etc., etc.
I await that smooth
Here we go.
journey through Heathrow.
Great. Do you want to talk about storytelling? Shall we?
Yes, I mean, not just for the sake of like bigging up our project, but I hope it's a really honestly, I hope it's a really useful example of how government funding, universities, creative tech businesses are working together to come up with scalable solutions. So, one of the problems all the small technology companies, the AR companies, the VR companies work with is they make these beautiful little gems, and it's like having like a beautiful jewel, but it just stays there. What happens next? How do you build a business on that? How do you start to do what television has done very well in this country, which is to format? How do you create scalable work and IP? So the project we're working on is called... Sure, thank you. Okay. The project we're working on is called Story Trails. It's part of a festival of creativity called Unboxed, and there were 10 projects selected, and you had to collect in your own project 7 STEAM partners. So we were working with Nexus, who are a big AR company. We'd also got some support from Niantic, who make Pokemon Go, and we knew we wanted to tell untold stories from across Britain using immersive technology, so AR, VR, and 3D scanning, which becomes a sort of immersive cinema event. And we were working with the British Film Institute and their film archive, David Olusoga, who's a black historian who's been very sort of outspoken about Black Lives Matter in this country, and he's been an advocate for, surfacing untold histories. Patricia is one of the marvellous 50 creatives who we hired, not as a diversity scheme, but we said, if you want to tell the stories of the untold stories from your communities, put yourself forward. We don't mind if you come from theatre, if you come from community art, if you come from, Patricia is a rare bird who already came from immersive, but we had a lot of radio producers. We just cared about the storytelling, the rest we can teach you. And they had to work with our technology partners to deliver, basically it's across 15 cities. There's going to be, starting in the library in each city, and these are, sort of somewhat forgotten places in Britain sometimes. We're in places like Slough and Dumfries, not the big cities. And we're telling stories from those communities by creatives who are rooted in those communities. And having been in television for a long time, it's actually very hard to build a creative sector in the nations and regions. So we wanted to put the work there and tell the stories from there. So one of the things that we are doing is this 3D scanning, and we went through a lot of discussion about what technology should we use. So this is a great example of how there is all that technology out there. We couldn't quite decide what to land on. We looked at all these very high-end scanners. I'm just going to whiz through a couple of these and come back. So we've initially looked at these very high-end scanners that would do a perfect rendition of your head, but as you can see, it's sort of rather creepy about them. It's a bit like, they've been like corpses, and we first of all thought we were going to build totem poles outside libraries and put people's heads on them around the community. But if you know what a totem pole symbolised originally, I was not great. But we were quite inspired by an artist who'd been scanning people with mobile phone technology during the Black Lives Matter protests. And as soon as we saw these, we thought, oh, actually, once you start reading the clothes, the environment, the signs, the whole thing becomes much more interesting, sort of anthropologically, to be able to decode what's going on in a city. And where we ended up with I'm going back and forwards here because I'm neurodiverse and I can't go in a line, was these 50 amazing diverse creatives who came from everywhere. It's the most powerful cohort. We had a kind of personal development the other day, and I've never been in a room with so many kind of purpose-driven people, because they'd come because they wanted to tell those stories. And for us to have created a cohort like this in technology now, who are upskilled in AR, 3D scanning, they know how to work with the technology partners, they understand some of the very practical challenges, like in England it's like the wrong sort of brick for AR, the wrong sort of grey day, the things that actually are challenges to this augmented reality technology working in the real environment are very mundane, and it's that tiny detail that really starts to make a creative, because if you can have all the storytelling skills you like, but unless you understand how to work with technologists, it's a challenge. So one of the things that we're doing on the AR trails, and this is in fact from Lambeth, where you're working. In fact, you talk about this one, right?
Well, this was a test trail, but basically in Lambeth there's going to be 2 trails, and one of them I can tell you about because they don't want us to tell you guys about. They haven't already
launched yet.
Yeah, it's not launched yet. They don't want us to tell you about exactly the stories, but this one is from a test which was run as a pilot at the beginning of the year, and Nexus were kind of basically, they went down to Brixton and were sort of trying out their technology, their AR kit of parts, seeing how it would work as a physical trail. So how the AR trails work is that basically you start and end your trail outside the library, and there are 6 stops in all, so the 2 stops and an end, so that's a library, and then you have 4 other stops which have to be 1 mile within that perimeter of the library, and you're telling a story with audio and augmented reality to a phone. So this is basically a test with a kit of parts, that retro projector there, and they've used a wall, and that's a bit of BFI archive. So it's kind of like, BBC is also one of the partners, so it's kind of like you're working with these kind of big stakeholders to create a story around your idea. So you pitch your idea to the stakeholders, and then you develop it, and it's great. It's very rigorous, very challenging, but it's wonderful because personally my story is a hidden story. When people find out who my story is about, they're like, I didn't know that, and they always want to hear more. So yeah.
I think the exciting thing for communities is that often the media seems to be not about you. If you come from anywhere outside London or the big cities, or if you are not white and middle class, so we've really focused on stories about working class voices, ethnic minorities, and we've really gone to a great length to pull out of the archive that you never see. And there's been a lot of original research going back to I went to Dumfries the other day, and they pulled out this 120-year-old tome, and they'd actually gone through the ledger to find out how much this nurse, who was a figure on their trail, had been paid, and that she'd been paid nearly as much as the doctors. And they found stuff in the archives about how she operated, and it's just tremendously exciting. Then you go out on the trail and you're standing right in the spot where she protested, and we always said that this was about feeling the ghost of the past as you stood in the present and projected into the future. And actually, having kind of designed that shtick for the pitch, when I stood there and I actually watched the archive as it rushed past me, I really got goosebumps. And to our need was to give voice to unvoiced people, to involve local communities in the excitement of future tech, and get them to think about what they could do with it and engage with it. So actually we're training librarians up around the country to work with the tech, not to be afraid of the tech, to share the tech. So we're leaving iPads and scanning technology and all sorts with people to do their own sort of fun scanning workshops. So there's sort of learning experiences as well as making a new archive of now, as we call it. And the second strand is these community maps. which involve a second strand of creatives who we call community mappers. I won't play this all the way through. How do I play on this one? Oh, there.
Yeah.
So this is just a pilot, but it's made up of sort of modular scanning. So you scan lots and lots of objects of significance around your town, and you record a lot of audio stories, and we put these together in sort of creative ways. The final version is much better rendered. And I mean, if you think about Google Maps, which has become to be sort of seen as, you know, a real representation of your universe, and then, you know, I like to try this exercise, if you close your eyes for a moment and you think about where you grew up, and you think about places of significance for you. You know, for me it was probably my church where I learned about community. Maybe it's when you first had your heart broken. Perhaps it's a safe place, somewhere you used to go with your parents. If you start to build up that little map in your mind, this emotional map, it's what we call psychogeography, but it's an emotional map. For me, that's much more real than the Google Earth version. And, you know, I think to use technology to actually resonate with us emotionally, not alienate us, is a need in itself. So we hope that this will serve communities in different ways to understand how we use the technology. I won't play you the story that goes with this because it will take forever. But I hope that gives you a bit of an overview, and I hope it sort of illustrates how we're starting with the need and letting the technology support it. You know, we rejected much flashier technology for accessibility. That's another project that can wait for another moment if there's time, but I'll leave that there.
Perfect. Yeah, and if we want to see more or learn more, you can visit and actually go and see these things.
Yeah, so they're in 15 cities over the summer. If you're in London, there's going to be Patricia's work in Lambeth. When's the tour coming to you?
September 10th and 11th. So I'm the penultimate stop. The last stop is in Lewisham, and I know that augmented reality trail is going to be around a Vietnamese story, and it starts off in Omagh in July.
Yes, we're actually launching in 2 weeks, so you've got a luxurious 3 months, but I've got 2 weeks until we're
so it goes up
hit the ground.
Northern Ireland to Scotland, goes to Sheffield, and then comes down to Bradford,
Blackpool,
Wolverhampton, goes to Wales, Swansea, Newport, and then Bristol. So it's going all over the shop.
But actually, if you keep an eye on storytrails.com, you can do all of the AR apps eventually from home. So you can do a tabletop version.
Yeah.
And they'll be available for a year. Right. But you know, there's been a lot of experimentation in those, and lots of things we weren't able to do just because of scale. But it's the first time something like this has been done at scale, certainly in the UK. We've needed the support of Niantic, but even their technology, it changes all the time. So what we're able to do is changing across the course of a year and a half's project. We can barely keep up with it, and it can't keep up with us. And so that's quite exciting, because what we're delivering is really sort of at the cutting edge of that. But I think one of the other creators has said to me that what they're learning is how to work at scale. They'd all worked on little projects, but learning to work across 7 industry partners has been a learning in itself, and quite important, because we all need to understand our different ways of working.
Yeah. Okay, that's fantastic. I'll just change the slide.
Sure. That's great.
Maybe just bring the slides back.
Nice to see you.
So I think we've seen there an example of just some fantastic creative innovation that's happening in communities, and I'm sure that people would be keen to go and check it out for themselves. I thought maybe we'd also talk a little bit more about the practicalities for businesses, and John, I know this is something that obviously you work with a lot of entrepreneurs in terms of commercialising innovation. What would you say, give recommendations or advice would you sort of give to maybe creative entrepreneurs that are just starting out in this area? Because obviously there's one thing to sort of have ideas and have use case, but then there's another to actually developing a sustainable business model. So maybe you can speak to that.
Well, there's a really horrific stat that 42% of new businesses fail because they don't recognise or understand their user or their market. And essentially that's my plea for the use of design at the very heart of everything that you do, because if you understand your user and you really spend the time to talk to them and really understand what their problem area is, then it'll make a huge difference. So that innovation, I think there's too much innovation that is driven by the technology or the this is not even critical.
This is the build it and they will come.
Yeah.
And believe me, I'm very critical of a lot of the techies I meet. Yeah. Come on, we'll come
so
on.
we're
to
on the
that.
same page.
Oh,
We're on the same
absolutely.
page. So that's my biggest piece of advice, which is spend the time really understanding the problem. Spend more time defining the problem before you start developing the solution. And unfortunately, too many people develop the solution. I think the second thing, and we at the British Design Fund, we provide money to for startups, but also what we do is we provide mentors. And most of our investee companies say that the money's been really useful. We couldn't do what we did without the money, but actually the mentoring was more important than the money. And but actually we do a sort of Dragon's Den. I don't know if any of you watch Dragon's Den. I hate Dragon's Den. I absolutely hate Dragon's Den because it's not real life, it's television, and I keep forgetting that. So I swear at the television. But we do a sort of Dragon's Den, but we're much nicer and we don't have piles of money on our but the biggest thing is looking at somebody and saying, could I work with that person? And actually, if there's a basis of a really good idea there, but and you've got the experience to say, but actually you need to pivot it in another way, will that person actually listen to us and do that, or will they never do it because they're so wedded to the idea in the first place that they're never going to change? And I think, let's be honest, most great products don't end up the way they started. The story goes that Dyson did 10,000 models before he introduced his machine to the market. And that's real design, that's constant iteration, that's constantly evolution and evolving.
Yeah, Thomas Edison, wasn't it? 10,000 patents.
Yeah.
Before he discovered the light bulb.
I think that if I have to say one other thing is, I think, we're talking about diversity, inclusion, and I think there's something about collaboration in all of this, that the future, I think, is multidisciplinary teams of people working together. So I was praising Rishi Sunak earlier on, in that he started off with what he talked about was great, but then at the end of his speech, he talked about STEM. He didn't talk about STEAM. And so apologies. So STEM is science, technology, engineering, maths. STEAM is arts, is right in the middle of it. And I think the Britain has to embrace our way of that design way of thinking. I don't know if anyone's have you ever seen the Jack Ma clip that he did at Davos a couple of years ago? So people will know who Jack Ma is, the head of Alibaba. He did this fantastic thing where he was a teacher back in the, he started as a teacher back in the day. He did this thing where he said, what we've got to do is stop teaching our children to compete with machines, because machines will always move faster and better and quicker than we can. What we've got to do is teach our children to think differently, to teach them to paint, to draw, to play music, and that creativity is the thing that is actually going to keep us one step ahead of machines, which I thought was just really interesting.
Can I jump in a couple of, because I fully support and endorse what you're saying, and I talk to a lot of startup founders, scaling businesses, and I ran a later stage startup many years ago, and you can see why they go down these very interesting paths where they build it and then think about the customer, the user experience later on down the line, because it's getting the founder in there they get an engineer or a head of technology, they've got the finance person, they've got the legal person, they get the funding, and they go, and many times say, well, who's thinking about the customer? You've got an interesting idea or a product concept, but how are you building this, with that customer insight as part of it? Thinking about, I don't know how many of you get frustrated with, you're on a web and you've got this terrible user experience, you're thinking, who the hell designed this? It's just awful, because things get developed and then they think, okay, well, we'll fix this, we'll address that later on down the line. And so you get this really mashed up bit of gobbledygook for whatever, whatever you see. And so I just think, wow, we've got to address that head on. The other thing I want to talk about and pick up on is your point about STEM and STEAM. And I think our technology sector here in the UK, over many years, we've done a disservice because we were pushing STEAM and talking to government. We need more coders and programmers and software developers and data scientists, and we do need them. Don't get me wrong, we do need them. But when I speak to particularly young people, but now many tech companies are saying, we're going into schools and we're talking to young people or career advisors saying, look, if you're into art, design, writing, whatever, keep going. There's going to be a home for you in the technology sector, because as many of these areas kind of converge, ultimately what we need are people who are creative thinkers and good problem solvers, and they're good writers. And if they're doing maths and science, fantastic, there's a home for them. But I think we did ourselves a really serious disservice, and now the message, and clearly our chancellor's not quite yet on message, but we're going to pick up on that, is to say it's a much broader tent here. And so when I speak to a lot of folks in the creative industries now, and hearing the two of you and seeing what you've done, is just I want to take this and push this out to so many people. This is how different areas are coming together going forward, where, have you ever done coding? Maybe you have, I don't know.
Just making sure my children learn, right? So they can be part of that conversation.
But are they going to need that in 5 or 10 years? Because the machines are going to do it for us.
But going back a stage, in schools, they're still very much pushed down a science or an arts thing, and I can't believe that's still the conversation.
Yes, and that I think is, and this came up, a few of you were at the event this morning, this came up in our event this morning, which was, that curriculum juggernaut. How do you change it? How do you evolve it? Yes, we're now putting coding in the curriculum, and the UK was the first developed country to do that. But how do we look at what we're all talking about now and saying, but where's our curriculum today? Exactly to your point, which is it drives people down certain areas and doesn't get them to look at things in totality. One of my other frustrations is that, many people who come out of our universities here, when I talk to the startups that are hiring them, unless you've done computer science or maybe two other topics, most people haven't even touched digital at all. So they're coming out into the world of work, and maybe they picked it up through games or whatever, but they haven't really touched on it in university. I think that's an unbelievable flaw from our universities, that you should not be putting out any graduates without having been immersed in digital. Yeah, maybe a bit of coding, but even just the basics about how do you set up a website, digital privacy, digital citizenry, all of those things we're not doing. And I don't know how we address that without changing the juggernaut.
I think some universities are, so I'm a governor at Falmouth University.
Yep.
They've got this thing called Launchpad, which is about...
Yes, I've heard of it. It's
great. It's a really great initiative, and it's about their understanding clearly is that what they've got to do is stop teaching subjects like that.
Yep.
And teaching subjects like this. So give students projects to work on where they can collaborate, because that's the real world.
It is.
IBM back a few years ago, now it may have changed, but they used to talk about the lost first 6 months. The lost first 6 months was they employed graduates, and then they had 6 months where they didn't know how to work a photocopier, and they didn't know how to. They just simply didn't know how to work together and bring different skills and expertise. And that's what we've got to start teaching. We've got to start teaching our children in preparedness for the way that real life actually works.
But also, if I may say, basically, I think also this kind of two paths thing is we're in danger of that actually happening now in the immersive industry.
Yes.
Because like there is this thing where basically, you know, it'll be like, oh, you're a creative person, you don't have to worry about the technology. And then the software developers don't have to worry about the creative. And okay, I'm not the most technically minded person, but I can grasp technical things. My background's video editing as well, so I can work with software. So like for my MA final project, I worked with Unity Games Engine to create my prototype. But not everyone was doing that on my course. So it is like, you know, horses for courses. You know, everyone's different, and that comes back to diversity. You've got diversity of characters and multi-skilling. And I think it would be great to encourage creative people to, you know, grasp some technical immersive skills, and also technical people as well to maybe explore their creative side, because they do have creative sides. And then that helps with the collaboration element.
No, I was just about to say, it's about literacy, isn't it? Not
Yeah.
actually being able to communicate,
Yeah.
not necessarily having a, you know, endless catalogue of knowledge on that area, just being able to intersect with people and, you know, have that overlap and understanding.
Yeah, because my thing is I want to create a prototype and then develop it to an extent so that people will, okay, I'll buy into this, whatever, or we can look at, as you're saying, the user experience, audience insight, that kind of stuff, and then develop it further. And then the, you know, developer will come on board and take that beyond. But I think especially with budgets and money, it's great if you have multi-skills so you can do as much yourself from a ground level, and then therefore you're making your finances stretch as much as possible, as opposed to being sort of dependent on other people, which, you know, you could do something yourself.
Yeah. Did you want to come in as well?
Yeah, I mean, I know that Patricia is unusual in that she's sort of, you've kind of like navigated this world. You know, a lot of funding is channeled through universities at the moment, who are then expected to reach out to industry and connect up with government and, you know, funders like UKRI and Innovate UK. And having observed the cluster programme from the beginning, I think, you know, I'm not a fan of this government, but I think it's one of the things they've really got right, that actually the industrial strategy has really forced us to collaborate. Universities aren't always the natural bedfellow of business, but actually they do a good form. You know, they love to fill in a good form and keep up budget. And things don't always move as fast as you want, but actually the collaborations I've seen between academics and SMEs in our region have been fantastic. You know, they've given them a new way of thinking. Culturally, they're very different. You know, so there is a particular company with a man called Paul in his 40s who's an architect I'm thinking of, but they were often working with academics who maybe come from a different sort of social background, or a different ethnicity or a disability, so who've like infused the work with some different perspective. And often we're working, you know, one of the more interested sectors is the arts and heritage sector, so we're trying to moderate all those conversations all the time. And you say we've got to teach children to collaborate. We're all having to, like, it's a painful birth learning to collaborate with people who don't speak your language. And we had a wasted 6 months at the beginning of this programme, where we'd got the money, we'd won the big pitch, and there were some partners who were used to a design brief who were saying, we're still waiting for the brief. We're like, you are the brief. You know, in TV, it's much more of a sort of organic, let's just have lots of conversations and the idea will come out of it. But they were used to a brief and then they would work to it. And it wasn't, you know, you needed an anthropologist in the middle of it to just kind of say, okay, you're speaking that language, you're speaking that language, and we'll move much faster if we just lay down our expectations. And eventually we got there. Hopefully we worked out most of that before the 50 creatives arrived, but I'm sure you're still navigating some of those tensions.
And I think that's why design and designers are really invaluable in the process, because actually they put the central tenet of any project as who are we doing this for, why are we doing it, and therefore that then drives the brief. It makes the brief real and it gives it tangibility.
And I guess they're often, like, certainly in the immersive sector, they're often the creative technologists. You know, they really are the designers, they're also the translators. And I think those roles that are truly like STEAM roles, there's no GCSE, there's no A-level, or there probably are a few degrees for that. But I think, you know, the minute you see a creative technology GCSE, I'm going to celebrate, because, you know, I have children who are strong in science and strong in arts, and I see them being pushed down either road. I mean, my son is 12, fantastic artist, really interested in technology, of course. And he said to me the other day, someone asked him what he wanted to do. Now, I must be the only Asian mum who's ever reacted to this. He said, I think I'd like to be an accountant or a lawyer. And I said, no! You must not! You're too creative to do that. But, he's got no models for where he can go with what he's good at.
Creativity to the law.
I suppose so. Or accountancy.
I think you're raising another interesting point when I look at the UK, and why tech sector is doing well, but where we can do better, and then there's the whole leveling up agenda. I look at our universities, and I think there are a handful, Oxford, Cambridge, Imperial College, that do a really good job on tech transfer, where they've taken the academic side, they've brought students together who are developing these ideas, and then working to commercialize them. And I think there's a really good opportunity over the coming years for universities, more universities, maybe you're looking at Falmouth as well, to really step up much more, because I think that's where we're seeing a lot of the innovation coming from in this next generation of companies. I was just with Oxford Quantum Circuits this week, coming out of Oxford University, there's a whole tech transfer initiative there. We need to do more of that, but also build in what we're talking about here, and to do them not just in Oxford, not just in Cambridge, not just in London, but across the rest of the country. And I think that, to me, is part of our sustainable, how do you get the regions to really step up here? I think Belfast actually does a good job of that as well. Belfast has the highest per capita inward investment from the US in terms of cyber businesses of any city in Europe, because they have 2 universities that do a really good job on the whole cybersecurity component of that. It's a bit different from what we're talking about, but there's a mechanism there that I think builds on what you were just talking about, what you've just been doing, that I think if we could get that right across the rest of the country, that would also go a long way to driving innovation in every part of the UK.
Yeah, and I think certainly from looking at what's happening outside the UK, and in particular we have a vantage point looking at China, which, there are hundreds of millions of coders and computer scientists and engineers in China, and maths, engineering, science, yes, not a problem, but on the creative side, that is perhaps the aspect where they would look at the UK as being a kind of a hub of creative innovation, and we are world renowned for our creators. You get the cluster benefits of having the tech and the creative alongside one another that perhaps it wouldn't happen in Beijing or Shanghai. So I think it is to some degree already there. It's just kind of bringing it together and realizing that to an even greater extent than it is already.
It's interesting, that point, because it reminded me, I met the previous Chinese ambassador to the UK, Li Xiaoming, first time several years ago at a big UK marketing event, and we were talking about things, and he wanted to talk specifically. He said the creative industries in the UK, he felt were the envy of the world, and he was very, very eager to have people from here go to Beijing and Shanghai and have Chinese from those cities come here to really understand the creative industries and the creative process. Building on that point, it was something that was very top of mind for him several years ago.
Can I jump in there? I had a very interesting conversation with Jeff at the beginning about CBBC. So when I was in TV, I used to host all the foreign delegations that would come to us, and we often had China on career visit. And the Chinese have been sending a delegation through PACT, which is the trade body for indies, independent production companies in the UK. They've been going on for about 10 years, but nothing had ever come of it. So they started to do it with, a similar number of companies from the UK and China, and they would basically do like an exchange. So they would come and spend time in those companies. They would go and pitch with them to the commissioners. They would be a part of the development process, go to the broadcasters, understand the mode of selling, and also understand why things get rejected, because often things stopped because we couldn't understand why it wasn't going forward on either side. And off the back of that, I went to talk at this the Shanghai Media Festival, and a lot of the talk was around formats. So, one of the biggest problems in our sector in immersive is how you develop IP around creative content. You can develop a beautiful thing, but it's just a one-off gem. So one of the things we've been pushing for, but hasn't been easy within this cluster program, is thinking about how do we help small businesses develop IP, develop what we call in TV as a format, so you can protect it as an IP unit, and you can think about how that then replicates across other potential customers. May I give you an example quickly?
Mm-hmm.
So one of the projects we did started off as something small.
Do I need to go back to the other
Oh yeah, is
slide?
that different? We worked with a little AR company called Arcade. Three guys, new startup, but they'd run a big digital business before. And it started off as Story Futures China. So it was a project with various partners in China, mainly heritage partners and some business partners, and the National Gallery. So the National Gallery wanted an AR project for children, and the company successfully pitched and it became this project called The Keeper of the Paintings. And so the idea is that you, as a child, go into a gallery, you point at a painting, and you're on a quest to find the keeper of the paintings. But as it takes you through the quest, of course, you learn a lot about the paintings, and you have to collect various clues. But we had this Children's Advisory Council throughout, and because it was also for China, we had a mix of Chinese nationals, British children, mixed Chinese, British children, and the project's been a great success for the National Gallery. You can go and see it, it's available for testing there now. But what was really interesting culturally for us, so they still haven't quite landed the Chinese museum it's going to end up in, because the cultural navigation has been quite difficult.
Yeah.
But actually, this Keeper of the Paintings idea, you can see how that is a format that's scalable. So now they're looking at the Keeper of the Planets, the Keeper, it can go to almost any museum or heritage sector and lead you on a similar quest. And that's going to be quite big for them, I think. It's a really nice, easy interface. As a kid, you don't actually have to type. You can give a series of set answers. You're looking for things in the painting. One thing we discovered in the user testing was, although kids have great imaginations, they actually wanted to be shown this magical world that you were talking about within the painting. So there was a lot more sort of graphic work that needed to be done to keep them engaged. And the at-home version, because we always want to get it out of the gallery and off the app, the at-home version is going to be on Roblox. And so we're working closely with Roblox to develop it in the UK. China's Roblox is slightly different. It's not quite ready, but it will be an educational game on Roblox in China when that's ready to launch. And so suddenly you see that what could have just been a one-off with an app you have to download for the National Gallery is a potential international business. But quite a lot of cultural negotiation. One of the things that I discovered from reading some academic paper, and some of you might be able to tell me if this is true, is that museums and galleries in China, I read, is a place you often take your grandparents at the weekend, that there was an obligation to take grandma or granddad to see something. I don't know, it might not be true. But we thought we would design something that allowed the children to run around and older people to sit down. Come back and show us what you did. But we were trying to sort of be about anthropological about it and understand different ways that audiences use the museum space when they're in there. So I hope it's a living example of scaling and cross-culturally scaling.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting just how that's often the challenge, isn't it? It's about the kind of translating into a different culture, innovation that not everything crosses borders so well. So that kind of partnership is critical to ensure that happens smoothly. Conscious of time, I think we've been going for about an hour, yep. So we might want to wrap things up in a moment. But before we do that, you've all been sitting very quietly, paying attention.
Thank you.
Well, we've been having a great conversation.
We've been having a good chat. But does anyone have any thoughts, comments, maybe exciting things you're working on that you might want to share with the room? Anything that you want to raise, or any questions for the speakers?
I have to say thank you to all of you, because you've enlightened me certainly about what's going on, and I feel like I've learned a lot more. Hopefully you haven't been put off by the smoke that's coming out my pen. I guess my question to you is, where do you see the future of this going, and how do you think one of the things that they've spoken about at London Tech Week this week is the metaverse. how do you think it's going to impact on the future of that?
It's a big question. I've got smoke coming out of my ears. When you say this, do you mean what? Do you mean
The
technology in general or
Yeah,
specific
the
applications?
immersive experience.
Tricia.
Oh, thanks. I mean, I think I see it as an opportunity to potentially see if we can, it's leveling up with the social media giants. I just think they're obviously, you know, got Facebook, etc. And I just think if there's a way we can encourage them to somehow, you know, allow more diversity, and I just want to get away from this sort of corporatization, because that's what I feel with social media, and I think that quashes diversity really. So that's what I hope. I mean, it's you know, at the end of the day, we had lunch before come to this, and Angela said that, you know, it's people are at the heart of the industry, you know. So wherever you have people, there's great stuff, and then there's not so great stuff. So I think we have to kind of be realistic about what can be achieved, but I think there are steps that you can have that go forwards. There can be advancements, societal advancements, but you know, I think there has to be some kind of protection as well for diversity, for groups that are underrepresented, and I just think that there is a danger that could just kind of be overlooked.
But also, I think sometimes, having worked in diversity for a long time in a different creative sector, if you do too much around diversity, or if you always label it as diversity, it becomes the sort of poor me department, and I hate that. And so, you know, I'm proud of this project because we just appealed for people who wanted to tell certain types of stories, and as such, we've got great intersectional diversity, a lot of socioeconomic difference, LGBTQ, disability, neurodiversity, and it's very interesting when they all start clashing with each other, and they have. But you know, a very explosive conversation comes out of that. And you know, speaking to what you're talking about, I think, you know, if you project forward to what this technology looks like when VR starts to converge with AR, and you know, that's sort of happening already, but if that digital space is owned by a few companies, and we've seen that pattern emerge, what happens to voice then? What happens to underrepresented voices, marginalised voices in that space? How do you own it? I mean, I did a fantastic session at the Beyond conference where people were telling me about all the kind of guerrilla AR apps, GUER. So people are starting to make their own apps for museums to tell you the alternative history of this space. You know, MoMA has one going on that you can download before you go. The British Museum has physical guides that will tell you the alternative history of the British Museum. How do you sort of fight that kind of resistance battle as technology you know, the big technology companies move into this space? And you know, we've even seen, like, we have 10 VR projects within this library-based thing, and we want to get them on, you know, Oculus's radar into the Oculus lab, but they're not really interested in small social history, well, a very big social history project, because you can't charge 30 quid a pop for it. And so that sort of commercialism, in a way, the things that come out of government funding are interesting experiments, but how do you make them sustainable so that that becomes the core and not the fringes?
I think also what you're saying is absolutely right with diversity, the poor me sort of thing. I mean, I see diversity as a real mixed bag. The ideal thing would be a mixed bag of people that, you know, not necessarily polarising, but they're just completely different backgrounds. And then I think that creates a really fertile ground to create great stuff. So you can have the white Pauls and whatever, and you can have someone that's from a completely different background, and you'll find that they probably could get on. They might have things in common. Just because you might be a certain skin colour or whatever, it doesn't necessarily mean that you have that much in common with someone who has the same colour skin as you. And I think sometimes, you know, people forget to learn to look beneath the surface. So, you know, perhaps the metaverse is potential to using technology to kind of challenge those things.
So before I came into this workshop, I was in another workshop and we were at a workshop where this part of this Healthier Working Lives program I'm working on, and we literally had a group of care homes who were presenting how they were using technology in interesting different ways to help both the patients and the carers, and also some very interesting technology companies who were starting to innovate, doing things in care homes themselves. And quite interesting, if we're talking about diversity, care home workers are an incredibly diverse lot, different races, ages, different literacies, and up to something like 50% of care home workers are not particularly literate. So you've got to actually develop things for those people that are not dependent on written instructions. And there were three sort of quotes or sort of sound bites that came from me that I thought summed up, if you were asking the question about what does technology do. And I don't think technology is just a thing. It's just it's the same as engineering or whatever. It's there to make things simpler. So that's for me. If technology is not working, if it doesn't make what it's meant to do simpler. The other one was, we were talking about different ways of particularly recording patients throughout the day and so on, all the rest of it. And they were talking about having to train somebody for a day to do it. And somebody said, if we have to train someone, then we failed. Technology should just actually be completely intuitive. And then the last one is, don't develop technology to replace, rather use it to enable. So I thought those were three quite interesting things. And if you have those as mantras that actually drive what technology should be doing in a diverse and inclusive way, then actually it's not a bad way of thinking about it.
Great. Okay. Well, I think if there's no other questions, maybe if you do have questions, we can speak to the panelists afterwards anyway during the networking. I think just before we wrap up, is Jeff still in the room?
Yes.
Jeff, did you want to come and say a few words about the Design Intelligence Award?
Thank you, Mark. My name is Jeff Chow, and I'm the UK chairperson for Design Intelligence Award, co-organizer for today's event. So thanks panel for your truly remarkable comments on diversity and inclusion, one of the most important issues facing the tech but also creative industries. Diversity and inclusion is not something we talk about as a part-time job. I think this is you talk about and go away doing something else as a full-time job. Diversity and inclusion is something we are talking about, should be as a full-time job, and this is the value we truly believe in, we pursue. This is something we breathe in, we feel, we touch, we live, and we celebrate on a daily basis. Promoting diversity and inclusion, there are many different platforms, and one of the platforms coming in today in the form of Design Intelligence Award, hosted by China Academy of Art. Design Intelligence Award is one of the most prestigious global awards celebrating the global design and innovation. So this is a platform to promote the UK, the best design and innovation UK has to offer. But participating the DIA, the Design Intelligence Award, is also a way celebrating and showcasing diversity and inclusion. I'm conscious of the time, and we have already sitting here for more than an hour now, so just 5 key points to remember. Because this award is currently open for entry and will be closed for on the 8th of July. The 5 things to remember: one, it's 3 weeks to go, and the second thing is only 1 hour of your time to do the entry, and that's a free entry. The third point is that £600,000, that's serious money to invest into your success, and this is a global recognition. Last point is back to diversity and inclusion. Participating DIA is not just great, but also good. So we can talk about this award later on during the networking session, but good news I want to share with everyone. I'm really, really this year's judging panel. So if any of you or your contacts want to pitch your proposition to UK innovation leaders, just act now.
Great. And if anyone wants the slide, there weren't many slides, but if anyone does want them, just leave your card or your email address, and we'll send them on to you. I think Russ, you were going to talk a little bit about some of the TLA events.
Yeah, I just wanted to. This has been a great week, London Tech Week, and there were a lot of international visitors here this week, and we did have a number of events as we're at the China-Britain Business Council, and Jeff was just talking about the DIA Award, to touch base on China. We actually have the leaders of our Tech China Advocates group that are actually based here in the UK. We also have people in China here. We've got Kelly and Lisa. They work for an organization called Senti Group. Senti Group, we set up our very first group in China in Tech Shanghai Advocates back in 2017. We launched a group in Shenzhen in 2019. This week during London Tech Week, they hosted an event where we announced that we will be setting up Tech Chengdu Advocates. Chengdu is the 4th largest city in China, and absolutely delighted that we're going to have an advocates group there. And later this year, in Q4 likely, we're going to set up a group in a city called Wuxi. Wuxi is not that far from Shanghai. It's in, I'm probably going to get this right, Jiangsu province. Thank you very much. I've actually been there. It's a great place. That will be our next group as part of Tech China Advocates. Tech China Advocates and Tech London Advocates are part of this global Tech Advocates network that we're setting up all around the world. We've got about 28 or 29 communities like the group we have in London operating in many places, and we've done some great things in China. We actually brought London Tech Week to Shanghai and Shenzhen back in 2018 when you were allowed to travel into China, and the world could move freely. And we did our big Global Tech Advocate Summit in China in 2019. So for me, design and innovation, we need to, obviously the UK is a world leader in that space, but China is as well. Many fantastic innovation hubs, incredible ingenuity needs to be on our collective radar. So I just wanted to share that with the group, that we did have some events this week, more to come, and through our Tech China Advocates group, we want to keep building those linkages and bridges between the UK and China. So thank you, and Kelly and Lisa, great to have you here.
Okay, if you can bear, I've got one more plug for you. We're organising a conference at the end of June, 28th of June, on the Chinese consumers. It's a full day conference. It's not tech specific, it's mainly brands that will be speaking, and people in the market as well, so we'll be beaming some people in from China. We're doing some separate events on the 30th, more for brands really, meet the buyer, and also some influencer focus groups. There are a ton of Chinese influencers in London with like gazillions of followers, who are like a fantastic way to promote in China. So if anyone's interested in retail and commerce, e-commerce, etc., probably worth coming along. So details are all on the website. So I think we'll wind things up there. Thank you all for coming. I'd just like to say a big thank you to each of our speakers, particularly Russ, because it's at the end of a very long, grueling week, and I'm sure he has visions of a pint in front of him,
yes.
Which I'm sure will be coming quite soon.
In the sunshine.
So I'd just like to, if you join me, to say thank you, and thank you to you as well for joining us today. Thank you.
Thank you.
And do feel free to stay, have a drink, drink the coffee if there's any left. Just checking with Jeff. I think we're going to try and do some short headshot. Oh, are you looking at
Already in.
Sorry?
Yeah. That's cool.
Yeah.
No, it's like, it was pre-pandemic, so it's like, oh yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry.
I think it was Zoltan.
Sorry.
I think
Thank you.
it was Zoltan.
Ah, Zoltan, yes,
Yeah,
okay,
Zoltan. So
yeah,
I'll
okay, there you
Zoltan.
go.